Following on from my previous video where we learned about the key physiological adaptations of different training zones, having an awareness of the principles of training will also help you build better plans or fully buy into what a good off-the-shelf plan or your coach is asking you to do. So, if you want to learn more about the basics of this topic, then stick around to find out more. In this short video, I aim to explain in brief the 6 principles of training. At the end of the video, you'll probably agree that the 6 principles pretty much fall into the category of common sense, but being fully aware of and then cross-referencing them against any training plan that you might be building or even following is no bad thing.
Number 1. Overload.
This relates to the stress induced in a single session. For adaptation to take place, the human body is required to exert itself beyond the normal stress levels of training. This could be achieved by one or a combination of any of the following: going a bit harder for each interval, extending the duration of each interval, increasing the number of intervals themselves, and reducing the duration of the recoveries. Put simply, you need to suffer in training in order to progress. Now, this doesn't mean every single session, as that would be a surefire way of flirting with overtraining or, at the very least, non-functional overreaching. But overload needs to be on a regular basis in order to continue to progress, which brings us nicely onto the next principle.
Number 2. Progression.
Progression is very closely related to the previous principle of overload, but whereas overload refers to an individual session, progression relates to the short, medium and long-term development of an athlete. You've just learned that you can increase overload within an individual session via a number of ways. But when looking at the bigger picture of the phases within your annual training plan, there are other ways you can ensure progression, such as the frequency of sessions, for example, how many you do in a week or in your microcycle, and the duration of them, for example, how long they are. Although training plans need to be progressive, you do need to back things off at regular intervals, both within your microcycle, typically weekly, and your mesocycle, typically a training block, in order to keep progressing. So let's take a look at our next principle.
Number 3. Recovery.
Training on its own doesn't make you stronger. It merely provides the stimulus for this to take place when you recover. So put simply, stress plus rest equals adaptation. When you are pushing your limits, you are in the process of breaking down your body. During the recovery phase, the body experiences supercompensation, which results in the body adjusting to new levels of fitness. The concept of supercompensation is quite an important one for all manner of training, whether it be endurance training or even weight training. So let's take a closer look at this concept in more detail.
To help us understand supercompensation, we need to consider these 3 separate components of fitness, fatigue and form, the latter of which is basically the total of the previous 2. After training stress is applied, fitness starts to improve as the body adapts to it, but over the short term, the training stress also induces high levels of fatigue, the result being a reduction in performance. As you begin to recover from the fatigue, performance also begins to improve above the previous baseline, as fitness is also continuing to improve. So, your form, which is basically a combination of fitness and fatigue, rises above the baseline, and it is during this period when form is above the previous baseline that you should train again in order to make good progress. If you leave it too long, fitness will drop and then the form will eventually drop below the baseline. The green graph on this diagram illustrates progress and improving fitness if you train during the supercompensation phase. The red graph, however, illustrates what will eventually happen if you continuously undertake strenuous training too soon and prior to supercompensation. Performance will decline and could eventually lead to overtraining.
As I previously said, supercompensation applies to more than just endurance training. And although other forms of training can contribute to you becoming a stronger cyclist and a more well-rounded athlete, ultimately you do have to do a certain amount of what you are training for. And the next principle we'll delve into is...
Number 4. Specificity.
Put simply, this means that you'll get better at what you do. If you want to improve your swimming, then swim more. If you want to improve your cycling, then cycle more. And if you want to improve your running, then run more. But that's not to say that you shouldn't include other forms of training within your training regime. For example, the inclusion of resistance training is highly beneficial to endurance athletes, not only because of the potential performance enhancements it provides, especially for both older athletes and females, but also in making you a more well-rounded and healthier human being. Having said that, specificity is still important, as illustrated by the difference between central fitness and peripheral fitness. So regarding central fitness, your heart doesn't know the difference between running and cycling. It responds to either in the same way by pumping oxygenated blood to the muscles to keep them going. But your muscles do know the difference between cycling and running. They are activated and utilised in different ways for each activity. So there is a difference when it comes to peripheral fitness, which means that you can keep some aspects of cycling fitness topped off via other activities. But it will get to a point where you need to actually do more of the thing that you're training for. Otherwise, you will experience losses, which leads us on to
Number 5, reversibility.
Use it or lose it nicely sums up this principle. Failure to regularly adhere to your training program will result in you going backwards. So that massive training block you did 6 months ago won't mean much now if you haven't done anything since, which, when coupled with the concept of supercompensation, as mentioned earlier, feeds into that all-important and key aspect of training, consistency. So given the choice of tearing the world apart for a couple of weeks or so of a training plan, versus a more moderate, therefore more sustainable approach, I know what I'd opt for, and for all manner of reasons. Another factor of reversibility to bear in mind when planning your training is that the zones which are quick to build are then equally quick to decline. Think of them as a mirror image. So you don't really need to be maxing out your sprint training during the off season. You'd be far better off working on the slow to build but slow to lose endurance aspect. Because even when you get into the blocks where you're focusing on the higher end stuff, you can easily keep the endurance end of things topped off with a weekly long ride. Lastly, if, as many do, you adopt the classic train hard in winter and then knock it on the head in summer approach, then you need to accept a slight downturn in performance as the season progresses. Now, I'm not criticising that approach, having done it myself, I totally get it. But I can tell you just from personal experience, so a sample size of n equals 1, that just one maintenance session a week during peak season can make quite a difference. So, just one more principle to go.
Number 6, individuality.
When it comes to training plans, sadly, much like the stretchy lycra we buy, one size does not fit all. Any training plan does require tweaking and personalisation along the way, which is something that I continuously do for my athletes on a weekly basis. So, if you are following an off-the-shelf template plan, then it is something that you will also need to do and get to grips with. Having in a previous life followed those myself, I know how tricky that can be without guidance and input from a qualified individual, even if you initially think that they are wrong in what they're recommending you do. Their training and experience means that they will often have the bigger and longer term picture in mind, as opposed to a bit of you and your mates' bro science approach. It can be so easy to get it wrong. A classic being when you're struggling on a ride or your results are suffering, it's easy to think that you need to redouble your efforts and train even harder, when in fact, it's the reverse that is often the remedy. Due to genetics and age, etc., we all respond differently. And each one of us therefore takes a different amount of time to recover from and therefore absorb training stimulus. For example, you could take 2 athletes with exactly the same FTP and have both of them follow the same plan exactly to the letter. The chances are that at the end of it, they'd be in different places due to their individual response to training stimulus. Yes, as coaches, we know what sessions will elicit certain outcomes, but our job is then to adapt and adjust these accordingly along the training plan journey. And coaching is so much more than just session planning. So I hope that this video has not only introduced you to the 6 principles of training and how these fit into a training plan, but you will now also make use of what you've learned to make further improvements to your own training. If you have enjoyed this video, then please do remember to leave me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And if you know of a friend whose training would also benefit from more knowledge and a less speculative guesswork and assumption-based approach, then why not share this video with them as well? All that is left for me to say is thank you for watching and embrace the process to enjoy the ride. Take care. Bye.